Today's conversation is about psychedelic therapies, specifically the use of psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, ketamine, and ayahuasca to treat various ailments such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Here's some highlights from the upcoming episode.
Most recent trial data, these are the phase 3 trials, shows between 2/3 and 3/4 of people who go through MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD come out the other side without a PTSD diagnosis.
Wow.
Suddenly, PTSD isn't who you are, it's something that happened to you. This is not a countercultural movement anymore. It's a cultural movement. It's not about tune in, turn on, and drop out. It's about tune in, turn on, and get more engaged, get healed, do better in work, improve your relationships.
Whatever personal thoughts anybody has about drug use for recreation purposes, I feel like we should all be able to get behind the idea that any substance that can help people live better, fuller lives by treating their trauma deserves, at the very least, that we look into it and explore it and see if it'll work for them. Brad, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Nick. I'm super happy to be having this conversation and to be getting to know you and be able to share a little bit about what's going on in the psychedelic universe right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems a very interesting space to be in. Let's start with, how did you get into this area of study? I mean, what piqued your interest first about psychedelics for therapeutic use?
Wow, what a story. I could not have expected that I would have landed up in the career that I'm in, or that we would be even having this conversation so openly about psychedelics. You know, if you'd asked me back in high school, there's no way I would have expected. I started out probably when I was 10 or 11 years old, and I was not put on psychedelics, but put on plenty of other medications. I was diagnosed bipolar very young. And put on a whole slew of antidepressants, mood stabilizer drugs. And throughout my adolescence, up through middle school, through high school, through middle of college, I was taking antidepressants. I was taking lithium, which is a mood stabilizer, to treat my bipolar as it was diagnosed. And was in and out of psychiatric hospitals a couple of times when I was very young, and had this feeling that had been, I now know, instilled in me, that there was something wrong, something broken about my neurochemistry, about how my moods worked. I would get these mood swings and not know why. So I was raised on drugs. Meanwhile, of course, in elementary school, I was also in the DARE program, drug abuse resistance education, telling us about how bad this category of drugs was. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker. Sure, why would I have any reason to explore illegal, dangerous drugs like marijuana or LSD or magic mushrooms? It's all just scary. Forget about it. Why would I be involved in that? Come around to first couple of days of college at Stanford University. I had just started working towards my psychology undergraduate degree. I would later add communications undergraduate degree. And I was curious to see so many of my peers using marijuana. I had terrible experiences with alcohol. I don't know how people could go have 12 beers, remain cogent. I had 5 beers and I was throwing up in the bathroom in my dorm. So the idea that I could use something very briefly and feel social and laugh and have a good time with my friends, that was revolutionary to me. I wouldn't have to use the alcohol. So I started smoking a little bit of marijuana.
Was your first time with any sort of drugs?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, first time. First time, peer pressure, or not really even pressure, just pure inspiration, I would now call it.
Yeah.
And I immediately slowed down. I remember sitting on the patio of my dorm at Stanford, looking out across Lake Lagunitas, this big, beautiful, empty, man-made lake on the edge of campus, looking out and watching the trees and watching the leaves kind of shake in the wind, and feeling like I had slowed down and learned to appreciate the nature around me in a way that I had never experienced before. That was my cannabis experience. I'm immediately thinking.
And were you still taking the lithium and other mood stabilizers at this point?
I was, albeit very inconsistent. So I didn't like them. I didn't like the kind of dulling feeling that they gave me. Cannabis brought out colors in a way that I'd never really noticed before. So here I am enjoying and appreciating this experience, realizing that all of this philosophy of the war on drugs was possibly misinformed and mistaken. I started reading up about 1960s countercultural history and learning about these activists who would combine art and political radicalism to create these monumental media events that would get circulated through the news and have these big effects. And there was this connection between the substances they were using and the art that they were creating and the activism. And I'm talking about Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, the Yippie movement, kind of drew from French political theater and combined that with these revolutionary ideas. And I was just kind of entranced by these activists. As I'm learning and reading about the counterculture, much of which started right around Stanford University. So I was there at Stanford University. LSD first caught on as a recreational substance in large part due to Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey being called into the Palo Alto Veterans Administration Hospital to be a subject in an LSD experiment. And they gave him LSD under flashing strobe lights and hammered him with questions. And now looking back, I wonder how he could have possibly had a positive experience with this. But he came out as a proselytizer. He came out saying, oh my gosh, everybody, check out LSD. This is an amazing spiritual experience. So this had happened just down the street from my dorm, albeit, decades earlier. And a friend comes up to me and says, hey, I got these psychedelic mushrooms. Do you want to put them in a milkshake and try them? I thought, well, it's not synthetic. Mushrooms are totally natural. I would never touch the synthetic stuff. But, it's like cannabis in the sense that like, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe, can try it. So I tried it. Didn't have a major experience, but I remember walking around with a cluster of my friends. This was my sophomore year of college. Walking around at night around the Stanford campus and just seeing these little circles of rainbows around the streetlights. That was all I really noticed at that time. Everything else was just kind of normal. I felt happy, but otherwise, that's what I noticed. I thought, wow, this doesn't seem so bad.
Right. And it wasn't a huge trip. You weren't seeing crazy things. It was more of a emotional, a psychological difference, it sounds like, rather than something crazy.
Yeah. So again, I'm thinking, okay, the DARE program, don't do drugs, war on thing. There's something wrong here. There's something wrong. And so fast forward another year, I'd kind of on and off been trying small amounts of mushrooms and walking around in nature. I'm on the phone with a friend. He said, hey, can I pick you up some? So we're speaking in code, right? Because we're on the phone. And I say, yeah, definitely. That'd be great. Just like, 4 or something. Yeah. Which I meant, 4 grams would be fine. That's going to last me a very long time. And he shows up the next day with 4 little squares of paper.
Oh, okay.
What's that? Like that's 4 squares of LSD, like you asked for.
Yeah.
Said, oh, so due to a miscommunication, I now have these 4 squares of LSD in my hand. And I've been reading about the counterculture and reading about Ken Kesey and Merry Pranksters and Grateful Dead. I just started listening to the Grateful Dead. I thought they were great. They're actually folk music. They're not a heavy metal band as I thought. Yeah.
Right.
And, I said, okay, you know what? This is a synthetic. I never thought I would try a synthetic. It's actually a semi-synthetic. It's derived originally from natural sources, but LSD is it's synthetically produced. I said, okay, I'll try it. So I tried 2 tabs of LSD one Saturday morning with a buddy of mine. I took those, and within half an hour was having the most expansive, bizarre experience of my life. Now, a lot of folks, when they're finding psychedelics, they're at a rave, they're at an underground party, they're in this very high stimulus environment, police officers and flashing lights and loud music. I was, again, at Lake Lagunitas, this expansive, beautiful, oak-covered natural area on the Stanford campus. I'd always been into hiking, backpacking, and nature, so I thought, okay, this works. So I spent the whole afternoon on 200 mics of LSD, which I now know to be actually quite a lot for your first time. And 2 things stand out to me. One, the first thing that stood out to me from that was I was sitting on a rock. I look over to my right and I realize I'm hallucinating like a 6-foot rattlesnake that's sitting next to the rock. I turn to my buddy and I say, "Are you seeing this?" He says, "Yeah, I'm seeing this," and starts to slowly back away. At which point I realized it was not a hallucination. It was an actual 6-foot rattlesnake laid out next to the rock. So that I was a little on edge for the rest of the experience. Everything looked like a snake. Every rock, every tree limb, every piece of grass looked like a snake for the rest of that day.
Yeah.
That was one thing I remembered. And the other thing I remembered was stopping for a moment. I must have walked 8 or 10 miles this day. Just staying in movement was therapeutic for me. Reduced my anxiety, moving through the trees. I looked up at the sky. The clouds parted for a moment. A beam of sunlight came down. I saw it. And at that moment, I realized that I was experiencing this beam of sunlight so purely, with so much just genuine enjoyment and presence. I thought, there can't be anything wrong with my brain. There is nothing wrong with my brain. I'm experiencing the natural world in its perfect state of beauty, a simple beam of sunlight. And I realized all this thought about myself as bipolar, as needing medications, as being kind of fundamentally broken, those were ideas that I had taken inside, listening to the adults, the therapists, my parents, my psychiatrists around me for all of those years as a kid, that I thought that something was broken and that I needed these drugs in order to be a functioning person. That simple purity of that experience, the simplicity of that experience. So the next day, I called my psychiatrist. I said, we're done. I need to do something else. I stopped taking my medications completely at that time, and I never started again. This was now 20 years ago. Now, I want to pause. It's my life didn't suddenly get perfect. It wasn't that I no longer had any mood swings. I no longer got angry. I no longer got frustrated. Of course, all of these things still kept happening. But rather than putting the locus of control outside of myself on these medications, making sure I was taking these medications, I shifted it to what can I do with myself? How can I adjust my lifestyle? How can I take care of my body? How can I cultivate my spiritual sense, my connection with community? How can I have better relationships? I started asking different questions at that point. So it wasn't the LSD. It didn't fix something. It wore off. And I just kind of left that kind of psychiatric mindset behind for myself. Now, for some people, diagnosis is important. For some people, the medication is an extremely helpful tool. I've come to understand that over these last 20 years also. But for me, it was just not the answer. It was really a hindrance. And this fairly simple psychedelic experience was enough for me to end that. So I developed this curiosity, this wonder around psychedelics as these tools that were at the intersection of the counterculture and radical political advocacy and history on one hand, and then on the other hand, as having something very close to do with psychiatry, with my pharmaceutical tools, that they could teach me something somehow. Now, I didn't know anything about research that had been done about psychedelics to treat mental illness. That was not on my radar at all. I thought they were kind of a thing of the past. So I'm majoring in psychology and communications, interest in journalism, interest in marketing, interested in, there was a book by Todd Gitlin, who was one of the presidents of Students for Democratic Society, SDS, one of the big student activist movements in the 1960s and early 1970s. He wrote a book called The Whole World is Watching.
Okay.
Mass media in the making and the unmaking of the new left. One of the pieces that he pulls out is he shows these examples of how camera angles, when journalists in the 1960s were filming demonstrations, depending on their camera angle, you could show either the protest or the counter protest as being bigger. You could show 100 radical activists and one anti-activist, or you could show 100 anti-activists and one radical activist. And depending on which picture you showed, it made people think one thing or another about the 1960s countercultural movement. So I'm fascinated by this, by how camera angles, media can shape politics so powerfully.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big believer in that book. The medium is the message.
I've got a Marshall McLuhan right here on my desk.
Yeah. Because the way that event is captured becomes the message. It's not, and we tend to think of a camera as just showing what is actually happening, but there's so much behind who's holding the camera and how they're holding it.
I mean, your setup is beautiful, but you might be in your garage for all I know. It's amazing. That's right. The magic that is possible with media. So this was part of my passion. And so now hopefully maybe you can see kind of how these things are coming together. By the time I was in graduate school, I was looking for what I was going to write a dissertation about. And I thought, well, at the intersection of politics and psychology and my interest in psychedelics, I could write a dissertation about scientific uses of psychedelics and how drugs become medicines. What is this shift that happens anthropologically, scientifically, politically, from drugs into medicines? How could something that I thought was a dangerous drug when I was in elementary school, LSD, also be such a powerful medicine? And how can that shift for that broader culture? So in the process of doing that, I look online and I find the MAPS website, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and a dissertation written by this guy, Rick Doblin, called The Medicalization of Psychedelics and Marijuana. It was his public policy dissertation. He was writing about a process that he had found through the FDA that you could take psychedelics, specifically MDMA, which I had not yet experienced, MDMA through the FDA drug development review process, get an FDA approval for one of these drugs for a specific indication, and that would open up funding. It would open up more supportive political and cultural perspectives around these substances, and it would open up a whole field of inquiry and a whole industry. So I read this dissertation. I thought, based on what I knew about political science and activism, this is going to work. I said, this has to work. Our American pharmaceutical industry institutions are so powerful, so entrenched. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. Everybody and their mother believes, almost without exception, there are some minorities, but that the FDA drug development process is the be all and end all of how we make sure that medicines are safe and effective. So this is going to work. I immediately reached out to MAPS. I applied for an internship. They offered me an editing position. At this time, MAPS had 8 employees. They'd been around since 1986. Rick Doblin had carried it on his back entirely himself until probably the mid-1990s, hired his first couple of staff. So they had 8 or 9 employees working in Santa Cruz, California on Mission Street in a converted house when I found it. I started editing the MAPS Bulletin, which was their triannual magazine about psychedelics. I did that for a couple of years, as well as volunteering at music festivals where MAPS could go and have a table and basically a goldfish jar for donations so that they could raise the millions of dollars needed to make MDMA a medicine out of $1 or $5 contributions at festivals. And that was a blast, getting to tell people at festivals, hey, did you know that the substance you're on right now is being explored in research, and it might be available as a medicine someday soon, and you could see their minds blow up. We didn't sign me up for the email list, and I did that for a couple of years.
Okay,
until the communications director at the time, Randy Hankin, who remains a great friend of mine, left to go do other things, and they offered me the job of communications director for the nonprofit, which meant, hey, we need more posts on Twitter. Can you please write the email newsletter and help us build a communications program that's bigger?
Right.
And I was there for 10 years until 2020.
Now, you mentioned the DARE program earlier in your talking about your story and discovering all of this. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the DARE program, because now that started in the 80s, and here we are 40 years later, and there's a lot of data that has come out about the DARE program and some of their messaging that in some ways it actually encouraged some groups of kids to explore illegal drugs and in a bad way for a lot of those kids, because a lot of their messaging was around, hey, you think all the cool kids are doing this is why you shouldn't do it. And they can now see, looking at what happened where they, in the communities where they ran that messaging, that a lot of kids who weren't going to go explore illegal drugs, they didn't, because they weren't going to. But there were others that the kind of that middle group that went, oh, all the cool kids are doing this. A lot of my friends are doing this, and kids are pushed by peer pressure, of course, at that age, and actually were more inclined to go look at that stuff. I think the DARE program had good intentions, but when we look at the actual effects of it, they're mixed at best, is my understanding. But I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember not knowing anything about illicit drugs until we had our drug education program in elementary school, where they give you a list of illicit drugs.
Right.
It's drug education about what's out there. And yeah, there's the issue of, hey, all the cool kids are doing it. And we're like, all the cool kids are doing it? Oh, but I'll tell you a story that I remember that stands out to me. So they brought one of the DARE days in elementary school, the police officers that were educating us, fully uniformed police officers. They come in, they drive in a I forget what it was. It was either a Corvette or a Mustang convertible, but like a very nice sports car, flashy sports car. They come up in that. The reason they came in the sports car is so that they could say, we confiscated this from a drug dealer. Now it's ours. So if you're a drug dealer, we're going to take all of your cool stuff. But you can see immediately how that's going to backfire.
Talk about the medium is the message.
Oh my gosh. You're like, I could score a Corvette if I sell drugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The program was designed by old people, not by kids. They had no idea what it's like. If you look at children's programming from the 1980s or before on TV, it's all what old network executives want kids to do. And so they're instructive, they're stodgy, and kids can pick up on that stuff like that. And I was like, we're just going to try to instill this moral sense into kids. And it totally backfired on the whole generation.
Right. Well, and it's an interesting shift on how when a substance is labeled a certain way, that it is then vilified in the minds of a whole lot of people. I mean, my absolute favorite drug right here. I mean, I love coffee, but I recognize that it is a substance that I take to change the way that I feel and think. And that makes it a drug, right? I mean, real simply. And I think we're in an interesting time where suddenly you've got the legalization of marijuana happening. But that was when I was a kid growing up with the DARE program. I mean, marijuana was described to me as a drug that would destroy your life. It was described as being just absolutely terrible for you. I remember discovering in high school that one of the young ladies, I don't want to out her, but let's just say one of the young ladies who was going to be in the running for valedictorian, and that was obvious from an early age. So this is maybe 10th grade, that I discovered that she smoked pot. And I thought, well, that doesn't jive with everything I've been being told. And that made me question, like, once that was solidified as not being true, it was like, well, how can I trust any of this stuff coming from this type of messaging that really wasn't exploratory. It wasn't honest. It was so draconian in nature. And I think that made it extremely ineffective.
I think you're right. Once one piece of it is shown to you to be untrue, the whole rest, why not pick it apart? So I was saying, I thought for sure I would never touch synthetic substances.
Right.
Well, after that experience with LSD, I thought, hey, why not? There's a lot of these substances that have been out there, like MDMA, for decades and decades. If there was something fundamentally toxic about it, we would know. So yeah, years later, I tried that one too. And that was also a very different experience than I'd been told to expect. Yeah, that was after I'd already known that MDMA had been being looked at for therapeutic purposes.
Right. Well, so that brings us to where we are today. So where are we at with these various substances in their use in a therapeutic use, not necessarily for recreation, but if we're talking about ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD for therapeutic use, tell me more about where that's all at right now.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Really exciting. There hasn't been a new class of pharmaceuticals added to our Western contemporary psychiatric toolkit since antidepressants, since SSRIs. SSRIs are to date the newest class of drugs that are available. And we're learning more and more about what those can do and a lot more about what they cannot do. Turns out there's a lot they cannot do, and it's unclear if they even do anything for most people that use them, not to mention side effects. So our views on SSRIs were already getting complicated. Psychedelics are a new addition to this Western medical kit, and a huge new addition. They're special in a lot of ways. First of all, they've been around for the entirety and more of human history. It's only the last 100 or so years that our society has criminalized. Before then, they'd been used for thousands of years in spiritual ceremonies, religious ceremonies, recreational uses, creative uses. So that's one way that they're special, is that unlike SSRIs or anti-anxiety drugs, or a lot of the drugs that most of us use on a daily basis, they have thousands of years of human use behind them. Another way that they're special is that they're not just one drug. They're not even necessarily related to each other. The only thing that cannabis and LSD and MDMA and ketamine have in common is that they have been classified as recreational drugs, as drugs of abuse or party drugs. Otherwise, those four substances have nothing in common pharmacologically or chemically speaking. They're very, very different from each other. A third thing that makes them special is most of the researchers, the doctors, patients who have been looking at these drugs at psychedelics for the last 15, 20, 30 years, they've seen them as adjunct treatments to psychotherapy, not as treatments in and of themselves. Our Western pharmaceutical model, our payer or our insurance company model, the way that we administer and pay for medical treatment now kind of generally relies on having these drugs that you just take, and they're supposed to fix a problem, a chemical problem. It's this kind of key in the lock kind of philosophy. Going back to my story, like if you remember, like I had this moment with the LSD of realizing that there's nothing actually broken in my brain. I don't need mood stabilizers to fill a gap, fix it in some way. I need a reorientation of my perspective.
Which, if you were in therapy, that would be considered a major breakthrough, right? If that had come out in a therapy session with a psychologist, we would see that as major progress.
That would have been major progress had I had an actual therapist. But no, I was just being prescribed drugs, and you go into your psychiatrist once every couple of weeks just to make sure it's the right dosage to re-up your prescription without therapy. I can't even remember having therapy. I can't remember a psychiatrist who asked me about my early home life. What's your parents' relationship like? Said nobody.
Right.
For 20 years of therapy.
Right.
Nobody asked this question. Now I know that this is where some of my mood challenges came from as a kid. It was coming from a very unstable home life where my parents were fighting all the time.
Okay.
It wasn't internal. It was external. But I needed something to help me see that was outside of the contemporary Western model. So where are we at now? It's been an exciting 10 years, 15 years ago. If you were passionate about psychedelic therapies, medicine, research, and you wanted to have a career or to work legitimately with psychedelics, that is not just be out there selling drugs, and you wanted to have an actual career you could put on your resume, MAPS was the only organization, one of only 2 or 3 maybe organizations worldwide where you can get a paycheck, pay your taxes, and say that you worked for psychedelics in some way. Now there's a whole industry. And that industry is clinical trial organizations, pharmaceutical developers, academic centers. There are clinics now in the US and internationally where you can get access to different kinds of psychedelic assisted therapies. There are training providers. So who is training the therapists and the psychiatrists who are administering these drugs? Somebody has to train them. So there's educational organizations. There's nonprofits, harm reduction. There are many places around the world where you can access psychedelic therapies in a psychological care setting or in a spiritual setting, ceremonial way, depending on where you go. We can get ayahuasca in Peru. You can get legal psilocybin therapy in Jamaica and Netherlands. You can get ketamine assisted psychotherapy here in the US and international. So there's been an explosion of investments and research. And the reason being is because there's a few organizations, MAPS is one of them, that have done enough research piece by piece in this bootstrapping kind of way for the last 30 plus years and educating the public through the media about that research. I've been loving, it's been such a joy to be able to take these revolutionary scientific insights that are happening now and to translate them into a language and a story that the broader public, the mainstream public can understand and get behind. And then there's little moments every once in a while that catapult the movement forward even more. MDMA is actually poised to be approved this year. We may hear in August of this year that MDMA has been approved by the FDA in combination with psychotherapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Psilocybin is probably not far behind as a treatment for depression. And ketamine, or at least a variation of it called S-ketamine, is approved here in the US for the treatment of depression as well. Every time an announcement like that comes out, there's this renewed interest and renewed excitement. And then you have people like Michael Pollan, who's a good friend of mine, lives here locally in Berkeley. I'm in Oakland, California, where we have decriminalized psychedelic substances here in Oakland. Michael Pollan's work has turned on an entire generation of relatively well-to-do baby boomers. Hey, maybe this is right for me. Maybe I should think about this. People are aging. People are looking for alternatives to conventional psychiatric drugs, which haven't worked for a lot of people. We're getting celebrities talking about their use of ayahuasca, NFL players talking about how ayahuasca has helped improve their game. Prince Harry is a fan of psychedelics and psychedelic therapies. It's really reached like the next level of visibility. And now it's kind of become kind of popular and cool and cutting edge to talk about psychedelic therapies. And that's all super exciting. I take some responsibility for blasting it from the rooftops and helping everybody understand. I also take some responsibility for some of the tragedies that are happening. It's like, I want to take a breath because there's been like a hype train that's been rolling down the tracks for years now. And I've noticed that like I've shifted. We were talking a little bit about this before the show. I think, just like wanting to it's like share a few words of caution that these, drugs are drugs. They're still drugs. It's exciting that we're seeing this shift from drugs into medicines, but medicines have risks also.
Well, and that makes sense. I mean, if I needed to take, I'm just going to pull something out at random, Prozac or, I don't know, a heart medication, I wouldn't just call up a buddy who happened to have some and say, I need 4. Like you did with the mushrooms, and then there turned out to be a miscommunication. You don't know how much you're getting, and then just hoping that it'll work and fix my heart or stabilize my moods. I mean, it seems if we're going to go about this to treat actual maladies that people are suffering from, it needs to be done with proper science to figure out the setting, the dosage, all of these factors that either lead to positive outcomes or negative outcomes. And I appreciate the fact that you want to control the hype machine. It's not as simple as if something's wrong, go try one of these 5 different drugs or try them all and everything will be fine. And I appreciate about your approach to all of this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's really important. Ketamine stands out to me right now, especially because it's legal here in the US for the treatment of depression, approved by the FDA as Spravato, which is a nasal spray. What that does is it allows generic ketamine in the US anyway to be prescribed off-label. we love drugs here in the US legal system. Just like there's so much freedom, more than in most places in the world, as far as what prescribers can do. Off-label prescribing is something that you don't see in other parts of the world as much. So as a result of that, there's been a wave of advertising, corporate development, fundraising for ketamine therapy. That's ketamine clinics, where you can go in and receive ketamine under the consultation or with the supervision of a trained medical therapeutic professional. And there are ketamine providers who will meet with you over video, like we're doing right now, and send you ketamine lozenges that you can take at home. And they just trust you to only take a certain amount, or to do it under supervision or with support or with somebody else there. Advertising about ketamine on TikTok and Instagram, where you have a lot of young people. I still see these on my social media feeds on a daily basis. It's like, just download the app. We'll send you ketamine at home, and all these pictures of smiling, happy 21-year-olds. It's really disturbing as a result of this increased access. And I think over promotion of the benefits and under promotion of the risks of ketamine, we're in the early stages of a ketamine abuse epidemic right now in some parts of the country, where kids and adults are accessing ketamine, and they're using it on their own in huge quantities without knowing what the telltale signs of ketamine addiction or ketamine toxicity are. Someone here in the Bay Area has finally started organizing a ketamine support group for people who are experiencing difficulties with their ketamine use. I'd never heard of anything like that. It's like Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, but for ketamine. And that wasn't an issue even maybe several years ago. And it's really scary.
Okay. Well, I did want to get to big pharma and then companies that are pushing these new treatments and how their incentives are different. Let's put a pin in that for 1 second. I want to get your particular viewpoint on the positive results you've seen in clinical settings, especially for treating PTSD and other situations for people using these drugs. I mean, that might be a nice dichotomy to talk about the positive use cases and then get into the negative use cases.
For sure. So I guess maybe we can take a step back. What is a psychedelic? What does that even mean? What does psychedelic come from? The word itself, it's coined in the 1950s. I think it was Humphrey Osmond. Psyche and delos. Psyche, the mind, and delos, which means to create or to bring forward or to manifest. So psyche and delos, manifesting mind, bringing the contents of the mind out, making the contents of the mind more apparent or more visible. Another way of saying that would be taking subconscious material, whether it's emotional material or somatic material or psychological material, memories, and bringing those up to the forefront and making them visible for the first time. So you can see how that would be useful in therapy. People can go through therapy, especially for something like PTSD, and be in therapy for years or decades and make only very small improvements, because the very nature of PTSD is the mind just wants to push it away. You just like, don't want to deal. And it's just too much. We got stuff to do. We're not going to go reflecting on our difficult past. It's a totally normal, natural, adaptive response to trauma that we all have. MDMA has pharmacological effects such that it makes looking at difficult memories easier. It does that in a bunch of different ways. MDMA is a very special compound. It works on the serotonin system, dopamine system. It also works on the hormonal system. LSD works very, very differently. It works very potently on the serotonin system, and the serotonin system alone. It actually mimics serotonin very closely in the brain. It's almost the same. If you put them side by side, LSD and serotonin are very similar. Whole other story, whole other conversation, but we wouldn't have discovered the serotonin system were it not for LSD research.
Oh, wow.
There's a whole book to be written there around LSD and the discovery of the serotonin system and the production of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. There's a whole story there. Psilocybin works similar to LSD, where it's mostly on the serotonin system. Ayahuasca works very differently. Ketamine works very differently from both of those. Ibogaine works very differently from those. Cannabis, totally different from all of these. So depending on which tool we're talking about, it might be better for different kinds of psychedelic therapy. So different ways of bringing different kinds of material to light and talking about it.
Now, how effective have some of these substances been with veterans, let's say, suffering from PTSD? Because I have heard of a number of very positive breakthroughs for people suffering from severe PTSD and with using different treatment options. Can you speak to some of those?
The most recent trial data that we have, these are the phase 3 trials from MAPS and Lykos Pharmaceuticals. It shows between 2/3 and 3/4 of people who go through either 2 or 3 sessions of MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD come out the other side without a PTSD diagnosis.
Wow.
And for almost 100% of people, they see some reduction in their symptoms. So almost 100% of people are getting better. A couple of people don't respond at all. A couple of people have kind of negative consequences, like they get slightly worse. Most people, almost everybody, gets slightly better, and 2/3 to 3/4 don't even qualify for PTSD anymore. And that doesn't matter whether you're a veteran with PTSD due to military combat, whether you're a sexual assault survivor who was assaulted 2 years ago, a sexual assault survivor who was assaulted as a kid. Doesn't matter if your house was hit by a hurricane. It doesn't matter if you're a firefighter with trauma from cleaning up bodies at an accident scene. It doesn't matter the cause of the PTSD. I think that's a really powerful thing, is that PTSD is this mechanism by which our consciousness tries to shut it away. And the symptoms are the result of pushing it away and shoving it away. Once it comes up and it's talked about and it's real, suddenly PTSD isn't who you are. It's something that happened to you.
Right.
And that perspective shift is enough to get people off of their existing PTSD medications, to get out of therapy. Thinking again now, because we're talking about it, about my early LSD experience. It wasn't MDMA. I don't know if it was PTSD or trauma related, but it was similar. It was that, I've got issues, but it's not who I am. It's something that is afflicting me.
Right.
But therefore I can have some control over.
Yeah. I mean, the veteran part speaks to me because my grandfather, he was a huge role model for me growing up, but suffered from PTSD from some pretty gnarly stuff that he experienced in World War II, and never could escape the symptoms of that for rest of his life from that point forward. And he never drank in front of me. But I do know when I wasn't around, booze was like his self-medication for that. And it was not a good, useful, helpful, treatment. And when I got older, I really wanted to understand where he had come from and what he had experienced. And it was it was all, I mean, PTSD was kind of a new term at this point. Certainly it wasn't a diagnosis when he was a young man. And I did ask him about it a little bit then. And I know he would have been the first one to just say, whoa, there's a treatment that could help more than 90% of people who try whatever this treatment is. I mean, he would have been open to anything that could have just caused a little bit of improvement, because it did have such a negative impact on his life, and it wasn't through any fault of his own. And then if we take that idea and expand it, I mean, we know how prevalent trauma is in society through, it's not just the effects of war. I mean, like you said, it's firefighters, it's policemen, it's people who suffered from sexual assault. And that has this echo effect in the way that they interact with everybody in their lives. And so trauma affects all of us. Whatever personal thoughts anybody has about drug use for recreation purposes, I feel like we should all be able to get behind the idea that any substance that can help people live better, fuller lives by treating their trauma deserves, at the very least, that we look into it and explore it and see if it'll work for them.
You're absolutely right. And that is what the polls are showing, without question, is that the support for research into psychedelic compounds for the treatment of mental illness, it cuts across party lines.
Right.
Across cultural divisions, across age groups. That's new. Even just 20 years ago, people would say, oh, no, that's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. So these things are actually really dangerous.
That's all now, the hippies talking about their drugs will fix everything. Yeah.
It's a bunch of hippies talking about, this is not a countercultural movement anymore. Right. It's a cultural movement. It's not about, tune in, turn on, and drop out anymore. That's the Timothy Leary thing. It's about tune in, turn on, and get more engaged. Get healed, do better in work, improve your relationships. It's a very different perspective now. And gosh, we really need, movements. We need something to galvanize us as a society right now that cuts across party lines more than anything. I just feel like there's so much division. There's so much fear and uncertainty about what's going to happen in this presidential election, what's happening with the wars in Europe right now, the environment. It's hard to look at the news these days. And the psychedelic movement is like good news. It's a lot of good. Just the simple act of me sending out a press release from my PR agency about a new study, no matter how small it is, or about, a new educational event happening, or no matter, how small or niche it might be, but it feels like good news. It feels like I'm getting good news out there, and journalists are responding. They say, yeah, finally, I can write about something that's like improving lives.
Right. Well, and that might swing us back to some of the negative things that are happening. And one of my personal favorite topics, the ills of social media, which is where a lot of that division comes from that you're talking about, in my opinion. And certainly we see, since the advent of social, or the mass adoption of social media, especially by young people, anxiety, depression, suicide are massively on the rise. And let's bring it back to what you were talking about with seeing ketamine being pushed on Instagram and TikTok. Yeah, what's happening with that? I mean, who are these companies that are selling it and pushing it and just talking about all the upside and none of the risks? Yeah. Let's learn more about that.
As soon as people smell money, everything changes. And I think that's the case with any industry ever. We can look at the cannabis industry as one of these examples. It's kind of like a mom and pop thing, an underground thing, and a boutique. And then as soon as you can go IPO, I don't know, people come in off the street with no experience, knowing nothing about the product. This is how capitalism works. Is as soon as there's money to be made, you don't have to know anything about ketamine to start a company that distributes ketamine through an app. You don't have to know a thing about it. You don't have to go to medical school. You just start the LLC and you go from there. Ketamine has been used legally as a prescription for many decades by anesthesiologists. Ketamine is a powerful anesthetic when used in high doses. When used in low doses, it's more of a psychedelic. It can be, still be cogent and alert and be doing psychotherapy with it. In high doses, they can take your leg off. You wouldn't know. It's great for surgery. It's just one of the greatest. It similar to like opiates. Tremendously dangerous when used in large quantities. Highly addictive, but I don't know if you've ever been prescribed opiates, but I was when I had my wisdom teeth out, and boy, am I grateful.
Right, right.
They're magic. I wouldn't have it any other way. But when used irresponsibly, very, very, very dangerous.
Yes.
Ketamine similarly has been used in anesthesia for a very long time. So a lot of the new practitioners who were coming in, realizing that you can charge hundreds and hundreds of dollars or $1,000 for a ketamine visit. You have anesthesiologists who were sending ketamine, who were prescribing the ketamine. An anesthesiologist is not a psychiatrist, doesn't necessarily have any psychological training. I wouldn't trust an anesthesiologist to give me therapy. I would to knock me out for surgery, but not for therapy. So you have anesthesiologists coming in with no knowledge of psychiatry or psychotherapy saying, oh, here we go. I can make a bunch of money sending out ketamine. There's also people flocking in, like I was saying, from other industries. Like anybody can start one of these companies. So you have people who are rich from cannabis or from crypto or from oil or from retail or for anything, just kind of flocking in, realizing that there's going to be a market. And so you have all these companies spinning up, and then many of them also collapsing, just like also with any new industry. And they're competing with the really legitimate ones, the psychotherapy clinics, experienced psychiatrists or counselors, therapists who are like, finally, there's a substance that I can use to assist my therapy for my clients. And when used in this contained space with preparation before, integration after, careful humanistic approach to the client, it can be very powerful, very effective, and extremely safe. And these poor folks are having to compete with these guys who are raising tens of millions of dollars so that they can start an at-home ketamine delivery empire.
Right. And they're just sending it.
And they just send it. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a Zoom call. Yeah. So there's a bunch of pushback happening on that right now. I think not enough pushback. But people are in need of different treatments, different approaches to healing, and are likely to bite on the first TikTok ad that they see. There's been one or two high-profile ketamine deaths in the news recently. I loved Matthew Perry. I loved Friends, and I thought that he was a comedic genius. And I and many millions of others were so sad to learn of his death, drowning alone in his hot tub. He had been going through ketamine therapy at the time, but had also, it seems, been using a lot of ketamine on his own. as well, likely in combination with benzos, benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety drugs, and who knows what else. The message there being not ketamine is dangerous and causes death. The message there being don't use massive quantities alone in water.
Right.
And that's the harm reduction in information that we need to get out there, is that when we see these high profile deaths, suffering, that's related to these substances, that we have to look at the context of use. We have to inform treatment providers and patients, policymakers, all across the board of not just the benefits, but also what the risks are. I'm not advocating for harsher drug policies or criminalization, even though I think we need to be very careful with them, because the harsh drug policies, the criminalization, the DARE style, philosophy, it doesn't work. If anything, like we've been talking about, it makes it worse. It makes people seek them out even more and mistrust the system even more. So we need adequate education and harm reduction support out there. We need services like Fireside Project, which is a nonprofit peer support line, which you can go to firesideproject.org and you can have a phone number, a free phone number you can call, and you can talk to somebody if you've taken too many psychedelics, or you think you might have, or you had a difficult psychedelic experience yesterday or 20 years ago. You can call this hotline and they can talk to you and help you understand it, help you make sense of it and process it. So we need these kinds of nonprofit, community paid for services that can help reduce the risks of these drugs as they become more accessible.
Yeah, and it sounds like maybe some sort of licensing for groups to start selling these things.
Oh, definitely. Certifications and training and licensing, just like for any other kind of medical practice or therapeutic practice, there needs to be accountability. If you're prescribing it and you do it wrong, you should get your license taken away. If you continue to do it or you do it really poorly, you should go to jail. We have to create those systems of accountability. We have to create those professional organizations. The people are working to do this right now in droves. But that's where we're at right now, where we have impending medical uses of psychedelics across the board, and we have not enough therapists trained yet. And it's kind of unclear how, when, whether insurance is going to be paying for it. So if it's not going to be limited just to the privileged few who can pay out of pocket, then how are we going to make these more accessible? These are the kinds of questions that the industry is working out right now. And it's kind of urgent because MDMA is probably going to be approved this year and ketamine's already available.
So without any sort of regulation, MDMA could end up on the same footing as, say, ketamine, where anybody can just whip up a shop and start pumping it out if it's not handled properly by various lawmakers.
Yeah, it needs to be handled properly.
How does Big Pharma play a role in this? Have they been pushing back against these new treatments? Are they trying to capture them and sell them themselves? Where are they in the whole landscape of all of this?
Great question. There has been no organized opposition from the pharmaceutical industry or from anywhere else. At no opposition to moving these drugs through the regulatory process and doing the research that's needed. So I'll say that. There has not been the flood of billions of dollars of big pharma investment from like GlaxoSmithKline or Bristol Myers, or any of these big players that you might expect. There's a lot of hypothesized reasons for that. One being, these are not drugs that you would ever take every day. So you're not just getting people on, like, for example, SSRIs. There you go. Now you're taking this and you're paying for it every day for the next months, years, decades, rest of your life.
Right.
Instead, these are treatments that you go in and you do once, twice, 3 times, once a year. even at once a year, there's not like this giant profit margin there. So the economics don't work out. And when combined with psychotherapy, the profits go down even further. With MDMA assisted psychotherapy or ketamine psychotherapy, the big expense isn't the drug. The big expense is a bunch of hours of your therapist's time.
Right.
And at $100, $200 plus an hour, that's what adds up. So there's the economic kind of lack of incentive. These would be mostly generics, the psychedelics that we know about that have been around for decades and decades, LSD, MDMA, ketamine, they're already generic. They've been around for so long, you can't patent it. You can patent varieties of them or patent different ways of producing them. But you can't patent the drug. So not just one company can ever just own the patent on any of these, at least not for very long. So the generic issue, that's another element, psychotherapy, economics. This may change. And there are a bunch of companies, some of whom have investment from quote unquote big pharma. I'll just say wealthy pharmaceutical companies.
That's probably a better way to put it.
Yeah. It's like, where's the line? There's middle pharma, there's small pharma. There's lots of small pharma in involvement. And there's some big companies that have invested in some of these patented new psychedelics or different delivery systems for a psychedelic, nasal spray, subcutaneous, injection, capsules, dissolved in lozenges. There's like a lot of different ways that you could patent a lot of these. And there's also a lot of naturally occurring ones. Ayahuasca and ibogaine are examples. It'd be like somebody trying to patent the marijuana plant. It'd be like somebody trying to patent sunflowers. You can't legally do it.
Right.
Also, how are they going to get reimbursed? Insurance companies are not on board yet. National healthcare systems, Kaiser, they're all looking. And if you look at the economics long term, it's a great economic argument because even if you're paying $10,000 up front for a series of, say, MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, that seems like a lot of money. It's like, oh, that's way more expensive than drugs, but it's not more expensive than drugs every day for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. So maybe there's a possibility there with big insurance companies if it could reduce their costs over the long run.
Right.
That's interesting.
I'm a firm believer that it can. And there's a couple of published papers around this right now. There's a lot of people working hard to have those meetings and talk to the right people and to show them those economic calculations because long term, psychedelic assisted therapy is an excellent investment.
Well, Kaiser says they're all about wellness and preventative treatment. Come on, Kaiser, let's get going on this one.
Kaiser says a lot of things.
Yeah. Explain in a little bit more detail about setting, and integration. Like define those terms and what that means in order to have a good experience or a more productive experience. Yeah.
Well, if any of your listeners are considering psychedelic therapy, I think these are important things to look out for. If you're looking at psychedelic therapy and the provider doesn't know what integration is, walk away.
Right.
Set and setting is also a Timothy Leary term. So, say what you might about Timothy Leary's overexuberance, irrational enthusiasm, and pushiness around psychedelics. He did have some insights. One of those being that it's about the set and the setting. It's about your attitude going in, and it's about where you're experiencing the psychedelic, making sure that you're adequately prepared and that you're in a safe, supported setting and that there's time, energy set aside for integration. The integration, I think, even more important than the experience itself. And that's how you make sense of the experience that you had and how you adjust your life or adjust your habits to take the most advantage of the insight that you had. So an example of that would be like, okay, I just did psilocybin therapy for smoking addiction or a nicotine addiction. A lot of great evidence on psilocybin assisted therapy specifically for nicotine addiction. I struggled with smoking tobacco since my high school days for 20 plus years. It's a hard one, right up there with coffee, but I haven't had as many problems with coffee as I did with nicotine. But like, let's take that as an example. During your psilocybin experience, you have an insight into, you can visualize your lungs changing. And you can see the effects that your addiction is having on your relationships and how you're using it as a crutch and not actually improving much as a person. Instead, you're filling all of that self-improvement time with either smoking or worry about your smoking. These are taken from my own psychedelic therapy experiences from years ago. Now, that's all perfectly great insight. But if you take that and you just kind of go back to your day to day, you don't do anything with that. That just kind of sits in there. That perspective, that vision kind of sits in there and it just kind of gnaws at you. Then you go out for your cigarette or your vape, and you smoke it. And you just have this little devil on your shoulder saying, you're doing bad things to yourself. And that's not good for your mental health. Right.
And that insight kind of fades away over time.
It does. And it does fade away over time. You kind of forget about it or you push it away. And if instead you have an hour a day for the next week set aside to find other ways to get that dopamine that you need, find other ways to take a breath, get some fresh oxygen. If you don't change your habits and spend some time and some energy, maybe some additional time with your therapist, figuring out what those habits are and setting up those habits. I have, some nice little fidget things like by my desk. So with that nervous energy, I can just kind of pick up this thing and play with it. That took time to develop. I had to go find these tools that were really, that's the integration part. And it's fundamentally important. I called my PR agency Integration Communications because I think that's where we're at with psychedelics right now.
Right.
We're not at the point of introducing psychedelics to our society. If you just look at the news, do a quick search, go on TikTok, talk to your neighbors, you'll hear about them. Okay. Most people know now that psychedelics are being looked at for therapeutic purposes, for neuroscience, for learning about the brain. They say, okay, that makes sense. What they don't know yet is how to access them, how to stay safe when using them, where to look, how to evaluate providers. They don't know, what are the counterindications that might make them not a good candidate. So I think we're at this point of integrating these tools with our society. It's, again, I think not a countercultural thing. We're not bringing psychedelics into these legal and scientific and medical systems in order to upend everything and to tear down government or anything like that, but rather to improve our lives, shift our perspectives in a way that's beneficial for ourselves and for our communities, for our families, for the environment.
If somebody is interested in using, or I don't want to say using, I want to say going through this therapeutic process, if they need to treat some sort of trauma, what is the method for doing so today in the best safe possible way?
Thanks for asking that. It'd be really easy after listening to our conversation to hop on Google and say, where can I find psychedelic therapy near me? Mm-hmm. Companies throw a lot of money at ads to get high up in those listings. It doesn't necessarily reflect on their quality. As far as MDMA assisted psychotherapy goes, we're not quite there yet. And it's one of the hardest things I think about communicating about this work is that if you're struggling a lot right now, telling you that you might be able to access some MDMA assisted psychotherapy in 6 months or a year. It's too long. It's just too long. But there are other options. So psilocybin therapy is legal in some places, or decriminalized in others. Oregon, for example. People are going to Oregon and finding psilocybin facilitators. Oregon has the best system so far, and there's a bunch of problems with it. The best system right now for vetting and training the practitioners who are administering the substance, for making sure that the producers of the psilocybin are properly certified and vetted, and making sure where you're getting treated is appropriate. Now, you don't have to be an Oregon resident. You can just go to Oregon. You can find a psilocybin facilitator if you can afford to travel there. If you don't live there, many can't. But that's one of the places. And that's only legal under state law, not under federal law. And it might all be changing soon. Unfortunately, there's a worsening epidemic of fentanyl, which is sometimes added intentionally, sometimes unintentionally to opioids that are found on the street. So there's been a bunch of overdoses. And so right now, actually, Oregon is at risk of losing its decriminalization of psychedelics and its psilocybin facilitation because of an unrelated drug overdose epidemic around opioids. I got a problem with conflating all of these drugs and lumping them all into the same basket. Imagine people dying of fentanyl overdoses on the street, and then therefore people not being able to get safe, facilitated psilocybin journeys for depression. These are totally different words. Colorado is implementing some legislation soon to allow that. California is considering decriminalization. So we're seeing more and more places in the States emerging for that. There are international places you can go, retreat centers, which is a great option if you can find a way to get out of the country. A lot of people can't afford that either. Jamaica, psilocybin, Peru and Mexico for ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT is another one. Ibogaine is a great option in Mexico. There are some websites that are pretty well vetted. Psychedelic.support is an excellent one. The Third Wave is another great website that has vetting and reviews. Also, MAPS, the organization that I worked for 10 plus years, is a great resource. Signing up for their newsletter. Also on their website, they have some links out to reliable third-party websites and such that can show you where these retreat centers are. Again, be very careful. Ask all the hard questions. Be very skeptical. I don't know if this is necessary for their listeners' safety necessarily, but you mentioned your grandfather, the veteran, World War II veteran. I just wanted to give a shout out to those veterans who may be listening, or those folks who have families in law enforcement. Veterans right now are carrying this torch so effectively that we have major bipartisan support for access to psychedelic therapies or psychedelic therapy research for veterans and active duty. More bipartisan support for this than ever in history. And that's largely because of the activism, the organized and efficient activism of military veterans. So just a shout out to those groups. They're by far not the only people who are suffering from the consequences of post-traumatic stress disorder, but have the advantage of being a valued demographic segment in this country. So we're seeing a lot of progress due to the veterans movement.
And then if people want to learn more about your firm and all the stuff you're doing, where's the best place to look you up, find you, and learn more about all that?
Agency's website, Integration Communications, offer public relations, communications support. They're only what I see to be the most ethically driven companies in the space. integrationcommunications.com. I love being added on LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to find me there, Brad Burge, it's been really great to connect. And I hope it's just the beginning of our conversation.
Me too. I mean, this was excellent. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to put all the links to integrated communications and maps in the show notes. I hope we get an update in a year's time on everything that's new in this field of inquiry.
Oh, there's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot in the next year. 2024 is going to be a big one for psychedelics.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please pay us the biggest compliment of sharing this episode with a friend and hitting that subscribe button. Okay, everybody, until next time, ask questions, don't accept the status quo, and be curious.